And it is Boxing Day 2020 to all of our friends who celebrate Boxing Day or participate in Boxing Day. Or I don't really know what Boxing Day is, to be quite honest with you. I just know I watch soccer and they always talk about Boxing Day the day after Christmas. So happy Boxing Day. It has nothing to do with fighting, but whatever it has to do with, I hope you're enjoying it. Chris, do you do Boxing Day?
Well, I got crazy Christmas leftover sweater day going on here, so I figured I might as well wear it.
There
I'm
you
still
go.
recuperating from the last couple days. I apologize. My face probably looks a little like the fat Elvis face that he had towards the end of his career, but I promise to shed some of that so I look a little better than a face for radio sometime soon.
Well, I could shed the pounds and I still would have the face for radio, so I'm okay there. So let's get into it. A lot of stuff to talk about today on this Saturday. Wall Street Journal broke news, released an in-depth article. This was a piece. This was not something you sit down and read in 2 or 3 minutes over Xi Jinping and kind of going through who he is, who the U.S. thought he was during the Obama administration, where they've been right, where they've been wrong, trying to trace his background. And we're talking about this a little bit offline. Let's kind of start here. Xi Jinping obviously didn't participate in the article, but they did provide people to talk to the Wall Street Journal, and you have to kind of start with that and say those people that are talking were really just parroting whatever Xi Jinping and the CCP wanted to. So it's kind of weird how to take that messaging, but that messaging, it actually tells you something because it tells you what the CCP wants to project to their people and to the world.
Yeah, I thought that article, and I'll repost it on Twitter. I put it up a couple days ago. That article was really well researched and written. Now, obviously, as a reporter's report on anything out of China, they are a little bit mitigated as far as how much access to information they have. So you always got to read those pieces as if there's some sort of CCP propaganda involved there. But a couple of the big macro points that I pulled from it is this idea that Xi Jinping really puts a lot of effort and had put a lot of effort into his ability to identify and feel with the commoners and the villagers and the people in the lower class and in the middle class and even the people in the poverty situations. And part of how he did that was literally living in villages and living in some of these hovels that people are used to in those outskirts of fifth, sixth tier cities. And that ability for him to identify with the people is going to make it that much harder for us with this idea that over time, we're going to see more of the influence and the aspirational qualities of Western democracies in there to wedge the CCP away from its own people, because they really are, in certain ways, particularly Xi Jinping, in touch with their own people. And I also look at it and I think to myself, wow, there's some lessons to learn for our leaders here in this country who oftentimes seem very disconnected from Main Street and very disconnected from the people that have elected them in these positions. So that was one of the eye-opening things that I saw there. And I think number two is, in that article, you can see that Xi Jinping has this large-scale, long-term agenda that he is focused on, which is really centralizing power, that Marxist sort of ideology, the ability to really position the CCP as the governing force in that country for a long, long time. And then on top of it, make China the world power and the world engine of economy. So we have our work cut out in regards to this challenge that China faces us. And I highly recommend people reading that article just to get a feel for it. Now, remember, if you actually read my book, I actually talk about this movie behind me, Iron Man 3, and the fact that we actually presented Marvel this idea of sort of a Xi Jinping narrative to put in the movie. Thank God they didn't put it in there. But it was based on Xi Jinping's existence that he had living in the United States of America, actually in Iowa. It's actually how he met our former ambassador, Terry Branstad, many years ago. And he lived in the bunk rooms of a family that was there in Iowa because he wanted to understand how people in middle America live, how they think, how they operate. This was not a CCP official moving to New York and living in a penthouse. This was actual middle America, Iowa. And you can tell that that's the way he tries to process and understand the kinds of challenges and the kinds of people he's governing and so on. So it was an eye-opening article to read.
Yeah, it is. And so this would be the difference between, U.S. politicians and Chinese politicians, everything you just said, but also if you read the piece, there's a disconnect between how Mao treated Xi Jinping's father and how Xi Jinping talks about Mao. And that's kind of caught a lot of people surprised because his father was kind of persecuted by Mao. In America, we would have to flesh it out. We'd say, why has he done this? What's the connection? Is there some kind of underlying corruption? Did Xi Jinping cut a deal with someone? What's the connection that made him kind of turn? He didn't turn on his own father. He speaks very highly of him, but spit in his face, for lack of a better term. And those are the things that the piece cannot explore because of the way that the reporting in China does. But it leaves you, and we talked last time about how do you undercut the narrative when you're talking about kind of a government like China. Those are the types of questions I think that you pose, those simple seeds of doubt that are planted there. This doesn't make sense. And I'm not saying there's anything nefarious. I have no idea. I would just like to know the answer. But it's obvious that Xi Jinping doesn't want you to know the answer for whatever reason, which makes me want to know it all the more.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you're 100% right on there. And you're talking about the macro takeaways from the article too, which is what I really want to impress to anybody that reads it, right? I mean, there's so much nuance to understanding China. Sure. That people look like us that live here in the United States, we're just never going to understand all the complications, all the different peels of that onion. Okay. So that article is interesting. You can get in pretty depth with what they're talking about there, but the macro, I think, is the most important. And when you look at sort of the way that he tries to understand and really fully comprehend the plight of his people, and then also his understanding of how leadership and how the protection of leadership works. In fact, there was one quote in there, I got to pull it up, but he actually voiced his opinions a couple times early in his career as a Communist Party official, and he was slapped down majorly for doing that. And he realized, hey, you know what? Until you have the political power behind you, you keep your mouth shut and you play the party line, right? And now that he has the power, he's implementing things that have never been done before. In fact, like no term limits for how long he can rule and various other things that are really consolidating who he is. And if you look at, for instance, the plight of Jack Ma, which is another story we can talk about, and Alibaba, there's a guy who really played the politics well for a long time in China. He sort of, if he was a student, he brought an apple a day to the teacher at the CCP. And then at some point, he started to speak out, and he did that without the political influence of somebody like Xi Jinping. And now he's seeing the ramifications for that.
The other thing that sticks out is right now we're talking about, just from a macro outside this piece perspective, you're looking at the blackouts in China. We touched on that last time, but those blackouts in China, and a few months back they had the one food or one plate policy that was going on. They'll have these policies that look very strange, and the further you get outside of Beijing or Shanghai or these other big cities, the more impact you will see on these far remote areas. But Xi Jinping and his messaging, as you pointed out, and I think it's good to remember, is whatever we're talking about, he has the ability to relate, at least to project that he can relate to the people who are out there, starving in the rice fields and trying to grow a farm. He understands that because he did go through that. And so that makes it interesting. When we talk about U.S.-China relations or Australia-China relations, how do you pressure the CCP and Xi Jinping? Because on some level, if he's saying, well, we can't power you guys, or we need you to turn off your advertisement, or, turn off this or that, he can also say, I've been there, I've done that, I understand the plight, this is for the betterment of the party. And which reminds me, I was reading my Mao quotes the other day, and I'll let you respond to that, but I got a quote from Mao that I thought was interesting. But go. What do you think about that? How hard to deal with Xi Jinping in general?
Yeah, well, and by the way, I'm going to add, for anybody that's watching here or sees this down the road, we are firm believers in democracy. We are not believers in communism. We are not taking the tack that, oh, Xi Jinping's a great leader that we should learn from and apply different skill sets from. That is not the case. What the more importantly is the way I sort of look at the China relationship, and there's The Art of War, which is a great book. And a lot of the lessons they teach in that book is about to know your enemy. And I'm not calling China definitely an enemy. It's definitely a competitive, a strategic competitor at the most dovish, and it could be an enemy at the most hawkish. But we need to understand the way they think and the way their rulers run that country in order to apply any sort of agenda to tackle the challenge that they present. So I think it's very important to understand the depth of what they are and who they are and how they think. So that's why we're talking about this here. And then when you're looking at the fact that the way he applies just even the most basic pictures speak 1,000 words, right? And the way he tries to represent himself as a person of the people. I mean, if you look at COVID, it hasn't been very often that we've seen some of our leaders, whether it's governors or whether it's presidents or whether it's our president or congressional members, like at hospitals, like checking out patients and how things are operating during COVID-19's crisis. Whereas Xi Jinping was seen oftentimes at hospitals and in the middle of the hotbed of Wuhan during the COVID crisis. Now, obviously, things were cleaned up and made sure that he was safe. But he really tries to get in the middle of that. It's sort of the way, if a hurricane hits, we want to see our president there on the ground, shaking hands and so on. But this is something that really speaks volumes when you see it on the cover of papers and so on. And I think it's something our leaders need to do a little more often, just to make Main Street feel better about the governance that's out there. And it's something that Xi Jinping applies quite often.
Yeah. So 2 quotes I read from Mal the other day, and I'll try to tweet this book out. It's a quotations from his works. And the first one is: the Chinese Communist Party is the core leadership of the whole Chinese people. Without this core, the cause of socialism cannot be victorious. And the other one was: we must have faith in the masses, and we must have faith in the party. These are 2 cardinal principles. If we doubt these principles, we shall accomplish nothing. Xi Jinping kind of embodies that mentality, at least inwardly. He's trying to, it feels like, when he appeals to the masses in China. And that's why I'm, to your point, Chris, a minute ago about, what are we doing? Well, on some level, you're just trying to analyze what's going on. It's like 2 people watching a chess game. You're like, well, why did he move that knight there? Or why did he, we're just trying to speculate on what might be going on. And so that's kind of the approach that we're taking, and what might be done in response. Whether or not we agree with that or not, it's kind of irrelevant.
Well, by the way, our friend Bill Bishop at Newbie has been focused over the last week on, I think it's 5 principles that Xi Jinping is pushing, and they're pretty Maoist, and he's applying some modern day words to it. But one is sort of all challenges and all chaos create opportunity, those kinds of things. We need to work together as a people to overcome these challenges. Technology and innovation and ingenuity by the people for the people will get us, so it's interesting to see how he's looking at today's challenges and trying to rally his people around that. And it's something that is going to create extra challenges for us as the United States and also our Western allies.
Right. So I would say, just with Xi Jinping and CCP, my stance, I'm curious your thoughts on this. And this isn't necessarily a China issue. This is a U.S. issue or a German issue. The government on some level needs to protect you from something. Okay. Whether that's a robber, whether that's a terrorist, whether it's an army, it doesn't matter. An asteroid, they need to protect you from something. Sometimes those threats are legitimate. Sometimes those threats are not. China is a master of having a lot of enemies. Whether or not those threats are real or not, we can debate that, the South China Sea and who's right and wrong. They are a master of saying enemy, 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 enemy. And what that does is it consolidates power. And then you take Xi Jinping's kind of approach, which is, I come from the bottom. I understand this is why we need to protect you guys because of this. And you look over the past 4 or 5 months, what they've done with Taiwan, with Hong Kong, with India, with Australia, with the U.S. It's not, again, there's a lot of opinions on what they're doing, what they're not doing, and what their ultimate play is. but it's not necessarily surprising. I think the question for me is, as we sit here getting ready to wrap up 2020 to go into 2021, is will Xi Jinping feel emboldened to kind of keep this path on, or as the COVID-19 vaccine gets distributed, maybe travel resumes, commerce resumes, will he kind of dial it back a few notches? Because it's one thing in the middle of a, in the middle of a disaster, a tornado's coming through the town, go rob the bank. Okay, no one's paying attention, right? But when the tornado's gone, to go rob the bank's a little bit different. So now things are slowing down. Do you think we'll see China roll back as well, or will they continue to push with Biden coming in and everything else that will be happening in 2021?
I think they're just going to keep going. I mean, there's a lot of momentum and a lot of inertia pushing in this direction. And I think they're feeling pretty emboldened with their advances on the rest of the world right now. So I think we got to be really careful in watching them and understanding what their next moves are going to be, because I do believe they feel like they're on the offensive attack. So I think they're going to keep encroaching farther and farther on certain things. And we talked about even things like freedom of speech rights here in the United States. But, and that's obviously something that we need to tackle and push back upon them on. But then you have more nefarious or violent or extreme moves, which they might make here once the Taiwan Strait calms down, and that's possibly an invasion of Taiwan. And those are situations where, yes, you have freedom of speech rights that we can push back on. You could say, well, there's nobody potentially that can die from something like that, but it's a terrible infringement on American rights. And then on the other side, a land invasion of Taiwan could be a whole nother level where people do die, and it creates a major geopolitical issue where allies in the United States have to figure out how we're going to react to something like that.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I'm curious. We talked about free speech last time. One thing we didn't talk about was the new Hong Kong security laws. And I'm not a lawyer, not a Chinese lawyer, not a special, but I set in on a deal about 6 months ago, whenever the new laws passed. So whatever, it's been 4 or 5 months ago. And there was some lawyers who were from China, Hong Kong, that were specialized in this. And their opinion was that right now, me and you could be breaking these Hong Kong security laws. And when we land in China, the next time they could take us, arrest us, and put us in jail because of we violated those laws. Now, I don't know if they're right or not. That was just their opinion. They're the lawyers. And they seem to be pretty fair on the issue. And so I'm going to take them at their word. With that being said, you talk about free speech. We talk about Daryl Morey. I kind of thought about that since last time. One of the things that the West should attack China on is that right there. We should make China, if whatever the actual law is, it's an easy step to say, you can't do this. Now, China can come back and say, well, that's not what it means. Okay. So you interpret it wrong, or it is what it means, and we're going to fix it, or it is what it means, we're not going to fix it. But it's an easy way to attack China by pushing back on where this Hong Kong law is, just to get them to kind of stop that advance. I think that, from a free speech standpoint, would embolden kind of the West. At least it's an easy step. Like, who's going to push back on China can't arrest you for something you say in the U.S.? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I think, well, it's obviously going to be interesting to see as the opportunity to understand whether they are going to retaliate for that against just U.S. citizens, for instance, like us, or not. But I will tell you, I experienced it firsthand recently in lecturing at a university where we were talking about the interaction between U.S. and China, the commercial exchange, the cultural exchange, how to market, how to promote product and services there, and how to approach it the right way. And one of the case studies that came up from the students happened to be a morals and ethics case study on how you apply the proper sort of thought process of morals and ethics, and the way you uphold the things that are important to you as a person, or important to a company, and important to a nation, while interacting with countries such as China. And it got into a pretty heated debate. And for me, I love that, because we need to talk about these issues when it comes to China, or when it comes to Saudi Arabia, or when it comes to various African countries, whatever it is.
Right.
And they can't be third rail, like we talked about, like on the last podcast. You need to discuss them. You need to talk about them openly, and then you need to start talking about what are potential solutions or remedies to it. It was a I think, a heated discussion, but it was also very constructive that we had in the class. And ultimately, I felt really good about it. But it was a couple of days later that I found out Chinese students, both some that were here in the United States, but others that were in China, had complained about that particular part of the lecture during the 3-hour course, and were really, really adamantly against it and angry about it. And they wrote letters. And I think it was, to me, a little eye-opening. Was this no safe space type of problem and the overly PC thing, or the cancer culture? Or was it actually the national security law, where those Chinese students were trying to distance themselves on paper from anything that was talked about in that class, so that there were no repercussions for that discussion to them or to their families? And my guess is that's exactly what that was.
Yeah, it poses an interesting threat, because if we have free speech debates over what can be said on college campuses with nothing to do with China, and then you start bringing in China and say, well, Chinese students are, pushing back because they don't want to get in trouble. That could cause problems about not being able to talk through the issues with Chinese students present in universities, and that's something that you're sympathetic to what they're concerned about, but you also don't want the issue to be stifled either.
Well, and there's a couple concerns there. One is, in this day and age of remote classrooms, none of them are completely confident that how that exchange is occurring over the internet is protected. Particularly in this case, it was on Zoom, which, as we know, Zoom has a Chinese influence problem, right? So that's number one. Number two is there's a real push, almost like the West Point philosophy, where if a Chinese national hears another Chinese national talk against their own country and talk in ways that would be a national security law violation, you report that immediately. So in a classroom of 100 people where 30 of them happen to be Chinese, they're all wary that one of them might turn in the other.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk now a little bit something different, something that I saw. And you've got a Hollywood background, and so I wanted to get your take on this story. This is from the South China Morning Post. Millennial gambling billionaire I can't say that name, Yuzo, dies at 39 as police probe poisoning case. It sounds like something out of a movie, but it's real life. It's China. Let's see here. Someone else I was following, Josh Yi, Chinese Economic Weekly, said that Lin and Zhu were reportedly on the outs. But rather than fire him, he slashed his salary to force him out, and they poisoned him through his tea. Chris, when you're all your time in Hollywood, how many plots like this did you see come across your desk, or scripts like this, rather?
No, I sent out a tweet this morning. I saw he was sick and possibly poisoned a few days ago, and then I just saw the report that he died the other day. That's stranger than fiction to me. And what's a little bit of a bummer is I don't know what's going to happen with the big series that he had the rights to, this 3-Body Problem, which is a famous book in China, which could actually be a really well done series by the Game of Thrones creators. Because what's beautiful about how that project got set up is it's actually at Netflix. So Netflix has no business in China, and they never will, because of Tencent, Baidu, and Alibaba controlling that streaming market, or at least right now they do. We'll see what happens to Alibaba. But what I thought would be interesting about that series is that it would be completely unrestrained from any sort of creative sensitivities that, say, another media giant might be worried about, because they have such a big business in China. So Netflix was, to me, the perfect place to make it, because they're going to be able to do it in whatever way they want and stay true to the material, but maybe even plant some very interesting sort of subplots in there that could be sensitive to that market, but make a better series. So now who knows what's going to happen, but that's almost like one of those Russian or North Korean plots. And I think if you go back even farther, and actually that Wall Street Journal article talks about it, is the Bo Xilai scandal, with Hayward and the British diplomats, and that murder back in, I think it was 2011, 2012, maybe something like that, where Bo Xilai now is sitting rotting in prison because of it. That was one of those weird sort of plot twist murder, inside the hierarchy of the elite of China. So this is yet another case of that. And it's just a really bizarre story. I'm curious to see how it plays out, because I'm sure there's a lot more to it that we'll learn.
Yeah. So how do you think this is being reported or being viewed by mainland China? Like, how do you think they interpret the story?
I don't know. In fact, I didn't go on the Global Times or any of their inside China papers to actually see if they're talking about it. It might be something that's a little kibosh. I'm going to have to check with some of my peers in mainland China to see if they're seeing it actually on the mainland newspapers, or whether this is something you got to use VPN or get around the firewall to see.
Yeah, because it's interesting, because this is a story where, some stories, okay, this guy's dead. Okay. So at some point, everyone's going to find out, right? You start kind of going through the levels of, so do you spin it and say that he died of something else? Do you say, no, there was some kind of quarrel and blame a third party? You kind of get into the spot to where, how do you deal with this story inside of mainland will be interesting to follow, because, it's a bizarre story, if nothing else. And
I'm looking at the Global Times headlines right now, and it's I don't see it in there, but it's just so funny to read some of these headlines and just see how they present things there, right? Like, China must be tough for the next virus fight, being diplomatically direct and critical, not a privilege of the West, how Alibaba probe can promote harmony among enterprises, entrepreneurs, and the Chinese society. It's pretty awesome to read that stuff and get an idea of what they're trying to project to the populace there. And quite frankly, how it actually gets projected very successfully too.
Well, yeah. So I'm curious about that. So, if you look at the outward talk about China's handling of COVID-19, I'm stunned that so many people take that narrative as that's exactly what's happened. I presume I have no idea what's happened. And so I'm apparently, I guess this is a response to the Global Times. Well, we read it for entertainment purposes only, I suppose. But no, seriously. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I won't say the name because I don't want to call them out. But they were like, "Well, look how China's handled the COVID-19 and how well they handled it," and they kind of glossed over the batch testing that China did with COVID-19, and just the fact that what they did and what the response might be and how they can play on the West. I don't know. I find the COVID-19 very interesting, because folks in the West want to look to China to praise how they've handled it, and to me, that's a very scary thing, because since when do we trust data out of China?
Yeah, I don't. Well, and it's part of their wolf warrior diplomacy push too, to get that narrative out there about how great they've covered it and how fantastic their vaccines are and how much help they've provided various nations around the world and all that kind of stuff. And we've seen countries like Australia and the Scandinavian countries, and for instance, us, push back on that narrative, which was sort of out of control and ridiculous, because the virus did start there, and they obviously had lots of flaws in the way they handled it initially, which created this mess for the rest of the world to begin with. So how they're putting the narrative out there now in order to keep their populace feeling that their governance is great is super interesting to watch, because it's crucial, right? Like, if their 1.32 billion non-CCP officials or party members start to think maybe this was really poorly handled by the Communist Party, they're going to have real issues. So they have to continue projecting the fact that they really handled this better than anyone else on Earth.
Yeah, I know that they've got to. I'm just stunned that so many in the West praise how they handled it, and I'm not sure. I don't know what to make of COVID-19 in China. If you look at other Asian nations, it seems that the coronavirus impact there, regardless of what measures was taken, just doesn't work out the same as it does in the West. We'll see how that plays out with some of these new variants. But I'm a little reluctant to praise China's handling of it, despite the fact that they lied to the World Health Organization, all that. I'm a little reluctant to say, hey, that that what they've done over the past 6 to 8 months with the shutdowns is effective, because then not only do they shut things down, they print a bunch of money like they would do, like we do in the West. I'm just leery. Listen, I don't want to be the guy who, when China says the sky's blue, you gotta go, whoa, no, it's not blue. I don't like that, but I'm also leery of praising the CCP when they have actions like this, because we don't really know what all they've done, and how they've manipulated the data. It's a little hard for me to take their data at face value, especially on something like COVID-19.
Well, we do know from various reports that what was going on in Wuhan at the beginning of this, once they realized the problem was as massive as it was there were measures taken that only a totalitarian regime could do. And right. You can argue, I was, around China during the SARS epidemic. When you see an outbreak like that, a pandemic take hold, there's probably no better government to actually kibosh it than a totalitarian regime. The problem is there's lots of ramifications for that type of crackdown, and a lot of people end up dying or getting very hurt during that process. And it's definitely a sacrifice of the few on behalf of the many. But how far you push it, you can't do that in a democracy, in a free world. You can only do that under the regime that they have there. So maybe if you're going to say, hey, there's one plus side about where it broke out, if they actually got it figured out before it started spreading around the world, like they did with SARS, we might be in a lot better shape. The problem was there was a lot of incompetence during that time.
Yeah, you mentioned Australia. Did you see the story about the guy in Antarctica that China saved?
I didn't see that one. What happened?
I'm trying to pull it up right now. Yes, apparently there was. See here, China helps evacuate sick Australian from Antarctica in 5-day mission from the Guardian. I'll just pop this out here so folks who are interested they can read it. It struck me as a weird headline because ships, helicopters, and planes traverse thousands of kilometers of icy continent in complex multinational medical evacuation. Australia and China have collaborated on a mission to medically evacuate an Australian explorer from Antarctica with help from the U.S. The operation took 5 days. I found it interesting because here, this is where China is really good at. Talking about the global times and all this stuff, is on one hand, they're like, hey, Australia, we're cutting out your barley. We're cutting out your coal. Oh, there's a guy in Antarctica. We'll go help you save that guy. Uyghurs, stay to the side. They're masters at just kind of doing this and doing this and doing this. And, depending on which headline you catch, because you can't catch them all, sometimes they look really great and sometimes they look really poor. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, look, they're great at projecting narratives that help the cause. And I mean, that's one of those great stories. I haven't read it myself, which sort of sounds like a wolf warrior story, like China saving the world. Look at us. We just did it again, kind of thing. And then on top of it, by the way, they're not the only ones that seem to be, pushing when they're supposed to be pulling, or pulling when they're supposed to be pushing too. I mean, I found it amazing that Australia, given the bravado and the fact that they are standing up to China in a lot of aspects, also at the very same time signed that massive trade pact with the ASEAN countries in China too. So there's a lot of hypocrisy going on out there. And I think I still commend Australia on taking a very strong stand with China. And I do hope that United States and our allies in Europe start to back Australia in a stronger way. And maybe we can all approach this China challenge together, because we're going to need that leverage. But at the same time, there's always very conflicting stories going on with all this interaction, because everybody is just so darn entangled with China right now.
No, you're right. And there was a piece somewhere this morning, talking about a new NATO, with the Quad nations out there. It's like, okay, I don't know if how serious the talks are, but it's like, we're gonna put a NATO to protect nations that want to buy goods from China. Like, I don't even. That's the hypocrisy that drives me crazy. Because if China's a threat, then it's gonna hurt. Rip the Band-Aid off. Don't do business with them. If they're not a threat, then do business with them. I mean, and I'm saying you can't negotiate. I'm saying you can't push back. But this idea of we want to protect people from the people they want to do business with, that hits me wrong. I don't know how does it hit you?
Yeah, it's just this idea that I guess we can be sort of pregnant. I don't really, we're look. The bottom line is people aren't talking about this issue enough, and I think that's why you and I want to come at it from sort of a Main Street layman approach, based on practical and applied experience that we've had with that market. Myself in the cultural and commercial exchange, you in the energy and commercial exchange. I think it's a real interesting dynamic that hopefully, as we talk about it, more people talk about it, and we start realizing how entangled this web is, and we start to focus on, okay, here are the things we hate about this relationship. Here are the things that they are taking full advantage of us on. And here are the things that we actually can really benefit from this relationship. How do we get those all to apply and to work together so that we can actually fix a lot of the wrongs and really focus on the rights? Because let's face it, America has built that economy. In fact, there was a report today that's going to be the largest economy in 2028 globally, which means it will be from that point on. We're hugely, responsible for the fact that they've gotten brought up to speed that quickly. So I say, hey, don't just cut them off. Don't decouple. Like, let's get our money back. We built them. Now it's time to get rewarded for that. But the only way we get rewarded is if you take away the things that are unrewarding in the relationship, the things that are damaging to Americans and America and our Western allies. Remove those and focus on the priorities that help us and help us make, help us create commerce, help us create initiatives that move them closer to a Western democracy someday, and really focus on the things that make us better overall from the relationship rather than the way we've been behaving over the last 40 years.
Yeah. And, to your point, if those reports come out all the time, I don't know, we'll see 2028, 2032, who knows? We'll see soon enough. But those reports are interesting because it does seem to pressure people to say, "Well, if you decouple now," and I don't think we should decouple either. I think actually, the more you can do business with Chinese people on the ground, the more you can influence them. The harder it is for the CCP to monitor that stuff, right? For me and you sitting here talking, of course, the smartphone's listening, but the more of that you can do, the harder it becomes for the CCP to actually, keep their people contained. And I think that's really what the big fear is. They're trying to push back and stop because they want to slow businesses from coming in, Americans from coming in, Australians from coming in, because they know that these ideals are going to get to the culture. You talk about the virus, it's a good analogy because, you have the virus, which you can see manifested by people getting sick. From their perspective, ideas of democracy and freedom are a virus, but you can't see those nearly as well as you can someone going to the hospital. And so they want to keep people out as much as they can to prevent those ideas from getting there. So I'm all for doing business with China. I want to say that. What I'm not for is wanting to do business with China and then the American taxpayers having to pay to protect you from China. That to me makes no sense whatsoever. If you want,
well, and by the way, and just we'll wrap it up and start talking a little more on the next episode about this. But in regards to the fact that taxpayers and the government has to clean up some of this mess, a whole other part of it is, Main Street has been decimated by this relationship for the past 40 years. Yep. And now suddenly taxpayers and the government have to pay for all of that terrible rampant capitalism, which, by the way, I'm a huge capitalist, but we got a little carried away and we ended up shipping off a lot of jobs, a lot of our supply chain, forced JVs, tech transfers and stuff, which has really hurt the Rust Belt and various other parts of this country so that people can't get great paying jobs. And we need to get those back and we need to focus on that. So it's all part of this relationship where it's entangled. There's a lot of benefits to it, but it seems over the last 40 years, we've been not focused on the benefits as much as we've been sort of rampantly throwing away a lot of the health and the good nature of what this country can be with the right type of relationship with China.
Well, that would be an interesting discussion because I disagree about bringing those jobs back. So I'm curious to see where that one goes. I'm not against bringing the jobs back, but I just don't think it's practical. But we'll save that for our next show, which will be sometime next week. We don't have a plan now. I know you're.
Yeah, I say we aim for like maybe the 30th, the 31st, something like that. Take a few days off, like rack up all the latest China news.
So next Wednesday or Thursday, sometime around then, we'll be back before at least one more, maybe two more before the end of 2020. Chris, good as always, and folks for viewing, thank you so much, and we'll be back next week.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of the holidays. Take care.